Welcome, my dear students, to this another class with me, your tutor, Atinyo Sekose. And today we are going to deal with a poetry here, a poem written by Lord Alfred Tennyson, titled as The Charge of the Light Brigade. It is chapter 9. So this poem is a historical, in fact, a record of a historical event. We are going to, but first, take a look at the author in order to get the perspective or the context here. So Lord Alfred Tennyson, Lord here is a title, born in 1809 to 1892. He is a poet laureate of Britain and Ireland during Queen Victoria's reign. So we have already understood that era, or if you prefer, era. So I hope you would also use that background context to understand this poem here. He is most popular, or we can say one of the most celebrated Victorian writer or poet here. So now let's take a look at the setting of the poem here. The setting of the poem is to do with, like I said, a historical event, that is this disastrous historical or tragical war, that is Crimean War, 1854 to 56, fought between Russia and Britain, France, and their alliance, that is the Ottoman Empire, which is now presently known as Turkey. So Russia fighting against these three nations. However, in the poem here, the Light Brigade is referring to a unit of army that is the British Army. And what happened to this Light Brigade? Why was the war so disastrous? What happened? That's what we are going to find out. So the scene, we already understood that the scene here is a war zone, battle fought at that point of time. Remember, this is a historical event. At that point of time, war was being fought on mounted horseback, swords were being used. At the same time, these were also going out of fashion. Remember, Victorian era is also to do with modernism. So here, a group of soldiers were using swords against big guns and cannons. So that is the scene that we find here. And obviously, in such kind of a war zone, we all know who would come out as victorious. So we are referring to a brigade here, referring to 600 soldiers, and it has to do with the British Light Cavalry. The order, what was the order in the scene here, or the setting here? The order is that they were supposed to charge the enemies, attack the enemies, and capture their guns. And what is again the scenario here? These 600 Light Brigade soldiers were not well equipped. They were using swords, they were on mounted horseback. In fact, when we say cavalry, cavalry are those soldiers who fought on horseback, and infantry war here. So infantry again to do with fighting on land. So now that was the scenario, and they were supposed to go and meet the enemy with against big guns. So what happened in that kind of a situation? As a soldier, we might object. Why should we go and attack the enemy who are much more powerful? We were given only swords and horses to mount on. And not just that, they were supposed to ride for more than 1.5 miles, a league. So that is what we have here. That was their situation. But remember, these brave 600 soldiers, they did not complain, they did not question, and they obeyed this without questioning, which shows that they are very dutiful soldiers here. That's what the main thing here is highlighted. Now, in that kind of a situation, they were fighting against the enemies with outdated artilleries, against heavy armed artilleries, big guns and cannons, and so on. And the soldiers, they knew that someone must have committed a blunder. They were suspecting. I'm sure it has to do with some misunderstanding. Remember, a commander would never send his army on a suicide mission, but 600 people sent them to die for no reason at all, or a thing that is something that is sure of. We all know that if they charge against such kind of enemy, they would meet death. So yet, they did not complain, and that was the great valor, the great bravery, courage that was highlighted here. And not just in fact, out of that 600 soldiers, not even a single one complained, and they charged in that manner, mounted on their horseback and charged for 1.5 miles. So, starting from their point of that situation, starting from their camp, we can say they are going to meet against big, heavy gunshots fired against them. So for 1.5 miles, and yet they did not waver, they did not hesitate. They took up that duty and they started to charge. They started to go against, fight against the enemy here. And so that is what we find here. And what happened? Obviously, in that kind of a situation, they were being bombarded left and right. Cannons firing was going on. And in fact, it has surrounded them. And yet, they continued to charge against the enemy. Remember, the distance is a league. So I hope you would get the emphasis on that. For 1.5 miles, they continued to charge the enemies in that way. And at that point of time, when war was being fought on the land in that manner, in order to reach the enemy line in that manner, just simply on horseback and using a sword against big guns and fire, that is a great feat. And yet they were able to achieve that. They reached the enemy line, and not just that, they drew out their swords and struck those gunmen. So when they struck their gunmen, the author or the narrator said that even their sword splintered, it splitted. And so they were at least able to do some damage to the enemy here. So that was the bravery that was shown. And the poet said, or the narrator said, that the world was in shock and they were wondering how that happened. In fact, at that point of time, this news spread in newspapers. So probably, and he published it in newspapers. So probably this would shock the people. How a brave 600 soldiers, very ill-equipped, and yet bravely, that they know that it is a sure death mission. And so they mounted or charged into the cannon's mouth, right into death, right into the face of death or mouth here. So that was, they know their fate, but they dutifully took up the order and fulfilled it. And some of them were able to return. So that was the extraordinary thing that we see here. And this is an actual fact that took place in the that took place in the past, and it is still debated, the controversy. And yet the poet did not highlight much on that, but here, this poem is a celebration of heroic deeds and a celebration of those 600 soldiers who bravely, without complaining, they took up the order. That also shows their commitment commitment in military here. That's what we find here. And so this is the theme as well. Now, the Cossack here is referring to a member of Ukraine and southern Russian who were their enemies here. What happened when they struck their sword? When they struck their sword, it splintered and spitted. We can also say splitted, in fact. Hold on, let me repeat that. So what happened when they struck the enemy with their swords? Even the sword split, and they were able to drive their sword through the gunmen as well. So that was the battle that they fought. And these brave actions made the world wonder. They were full of admiration for these brave soldiers. So that is what you would find in the last stanza. And that itself encompasses the theme. So the theme here is, like I said, it is to do with heroic deeds. It is a celebration of those 600 soldiers, brave soldiers, who knew that they were marching to their death, but continued to fulfill the duty, and not just fulfill the duty, but were also able to attack the enemy, and at least was able to do a little bit of damage to the enemy here. And so here we can say that it is also about commitment to the military, in fact, commitment to military, or commitment and dutifulness to their commander. So even though, remember, they knew that there must be a miscommunication, they carried out the mission. Even though they knew for sure that they are going to die in that manner. So I hope these also give you some ideas about phrases. In your lesson too, we have phrases and idioms about the picture of toy soldiers, and famous songs were also sung about toy soldiers and so on. So I hope you would also take some time to go and check it out. Now we are going to move on to the poetic device here. Lord Tennyson is actually very famous for the use of alliteration. And what is alliteration? Alliteration is a literary device or a poetic device, we can say, or we can also say a tool for writing. And alliteration is a literary device that uses consonant sounds, repetitive consonant sounds. So that's what you would find. When you read out the poem aloud, you would be able to understand or get the rhythm of the poem here. It is also very musical in the fact that it has make use of alliteration. Take the example of, remember, alliteration is to do with consonant sounds here. So take the example of the nursery rhyme, Peter Patter, raindrops, Peter Patter. So the P here is the consonant sound. And in our text too, saber stroke, world wandered, and so on, the W consonant sound. So that is being repeated. So that is alliteration. I hope you would try to take some time and find out more of these in the poem. And the last one, that is onomatopoeia. That is words that represent sound or sound like their meaning. That sounds a little confusing here, but let me give you this simple example. Instead of saying cow, if I say moo, taking the sound moo, that the sound that cows make. So that is the word moo here is onomatopoeia. So that's what we have here. And you are required in your text, you would come across a question that says, find out for the cannons that were being volleyed and that the thunder in that battlefield scene. So I hope you would also try to think up of some more examples and also connect it to the poem here. And very quickly, here is a brief recapitulation of the poem here. It is, the theme is all about heroic deeds. It is about a celebration of 600 soldiers who laid down their lives for their nation. And even though they know that it is going to be a sure death, it is a mission that is sure to fail, they dutifully fulfill the order, that is to charge the enemy and capture their guns. And for a league, they charged on, and at that point of time, for that one league itself, they were being bombarded left and right, and even in front, obviously, with guns firing and cannons shooting at them, and yet they were able to manage to reach the enemy line and even kill those gunmen. And some of them lost their lives, and there was a lot of casualties, in fact, and casualties in the sense that even the soldiers, some of the soldiers died, and even so many casualties were done to the horses. So that was the scene here, and yet some of them made it out alive. And so here, when people hear such kind of bravery on the part of these 600 soldiers, people were in awe, people were in admiration, great admiration. Why? Because not for the fact that they fulfill a foolish mission, but for the fact that they brought duty in front of everything else. So that is the valor, the bravery, the courage, the commitment to the military that they had shown. And we also see here the glory and the reputation that they have earned, all because they were willingly obeying the order that was given by their commander. And we have here, remember, Lord Tennyson is very famous with his alliteration. So he used a lot of that poetic device. And so you would find that when you read it out aloud, you would get the rhythm, and make sure you try to read it. Because of time constraint here, I'm not able to read out the poem here, but read it out. And after you work out your exercise, perhaps you can also try presenting it to your family and so on. So let's discuss another poetic device here. The poem is rich with imagery. In fact, I have also mentioned it in the previous discussion here. So what is imagery? Imagery is creating mental pictures in the minds of the reader. So what kind of mental pictures? Using words, describing a scenario or a situation, and which help the listeners or the reader to be able to picture the scene. So when we are reading this, we are also able to picture a group of 600 brave soldiers charging against the enemies. And at the same time, we are also able to picture that it was such a great chaos when they reached the enemy line, and that there was all smoke, and there was this volleyed and thunder and so on. So that is volleyed of cannons and thunder, in fact. So that is what we can picture in our minds, such great commotions. And yet we are also filled with emotions for these 600 soldiers. Why? Because it was narrated in such a way that we know that these soldiers are marching on to their death. And here, that is when we understood that they are marching straight into the cannon's mouth. That is also the phrase that we can understand here. So all those things has created pictures. In fact, we are able to conjure up a very old scene, like a movie scene, where battles are being fought on mounted horses and swords were being used. In fact, if you are able to picture it, mentally picture it, the poet has also mentioned that the sword splintered. So you can even imagine the sound, what kind of a sound it was making as they struck the enemy. So these are the strong mental imageries that you would find in the poem here. And if you take time to read the poem, you would find plenty to cite for examples. Now, with that, we have come to the end of the poetic devices, but now we would very quickly discuss a few of the questions that you might be in doubt. So it is on page 96, part B, question number 2. War never does anyone any good. Do you agree with this statement? Now, after reading this poem, you have understood what happened in such a disastrous or tragic war scene here. 600 people simply rushing towards their death. And yet, we find that in such kind of a war setting, that is what we will find. And yet, the question is required in asking you in such a way that whether you say that war is a good thing or not, or whether you say war is a bad thing or not, it is up to you to decide. It is asking you your view. So when it comes, this is for your general information, when it comes to these kind of questions, whether you choose yes or no, both are correct. The problem is that, or the thing that you have to do is that you have to give instances, all right, justify it very clearly, give points, in other words, to justify that, yes, war is wrong because many people can lose their life. No, war is right because it can also bring out a lot of, it also bring out a lot of good qualities like obeying orders and being dutiful, being committed to the cause and so on. It can also bring out your courage and your reputation. It will also help you to deal with such kind of terrible things, you know, able to manage, trained for those kind of things and so on. So if you think about it, there is no right or wrong answer. So, but make sure that you justify it enough with points. On that note, we would be winding up today's class. Thank you all very much for joining me.